Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here tonight. In case we've not yet met, I'm Josh Lunton, Chief Executive of the Anglo-Israel Association. Our primary purpose is to inform and educate the Anglo world about Israel, in particular the UK-Israel relationship, encouraging bilateral exchanges at every level, advancing mutual understanding, and amplifying the positive impact of these activities. Just yesterday, Britain and Israel signed a new memorandum of understanding for faster and deeper collaboration on science, technology, research, and innovation. If you're interested in finding out more about this landmark agreement, my email is joshua@anglo-israelassociation.com. Tonight's event will hopefully go behind the headlines to provide context and deepen our understanding of current events in Israel. For decades, the AIA has fostered goodwill between Brits and Israelis at the highest levels of public and intellectual life. As a small UK charity which enjoys support from across the political spectrum from people of many faiths, as well as none, every contribution matters to us. If you enjoy events like this, please help support our activities by making a donation via our website, anglo-israelassociation.com, or email me directly at joshua@anglo-israelassociation.com. So, without further ado, I would like to turn to our moderator, journalist Sandy Rashty, to introduce our panel and start the discussion. Sandy, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Josh. Thank you all for being here for what I'm sure will be a very interesting discussion between Mark Regev, Israel's former ambassador to the United Kingdom, who currently sits as chair of the Abba Eban Institute for Diplomacy and Foreign Relations at Reichman University, alongside journalist and author Anshel Pfeffer, who's not only already written a book about Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but who is currently working on a book about Jewish fundamentalism. The focus of our discussion this evening, because there's a lot we could talk about, is Whither Prime Minister Netanyahu and the current Israeli political outlook. So in case some of you needed to Google the term as I did, it's essentially what's next. Just some basic housekeeping. If you could please post in your comments where you're watching this event from, and if you could post any questions in the comments section just towards your right, we will look to get to those questions at the end. So without any further ado, if we start talking about the man himself, about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his harshest critics would list a lot of accusations against him. They'd say he's power hungry. They'd say he's ambitious. They'd say, the alliances with ultra right wing groups, with ultra orthodox groups aren't what he'd really like, but he'll do anything for a bit of power. And there's so many more criticisms that they'll also levy, especially with what's going on at the moment, including avoiding criminal investigations. And that's just some of it. Mark, if I were to come to you first, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu more than most of us here. Do you think any of those criticisms are fair?
Well, you can't be in public life, not in Britain and not in Israel, without being criticized. And when you've been at the top so many years, as Netanyahu has been, of course you're going to be the brunt of criticism. It comes with the job. If there's a British comparison, when Blair had been in office 10 years, I think before he turned it over to Gordon Brown, I think it was hard to find anyone who had anything nice to say about Tony Blair. So there's a negative longevity impact, I think, as well.
Do you think the criticisms are fair, though? Have there been any of those listed above that you might have personally or privately said to him?
Look, you can't be in public life and take decisions and not be criticized. That's the bottom line. And that's true. Let's say the criticism of his current right-wing coalition, and a lot of people would agree with what you said, Sandy, that these are not Netanyahu's favorite political partners. Yes, he has problems with some of these people. They're too extreme for him. I always thought that he felt the most comfortable when he was the prime minister in a coalition where he had some people to the right of him and some people to the left of him, and then he could play them off against each other, and then he was the conductor of the orchestra, so to speak. And in this current coalition government, he's like the left, and it's probably a difficult place for him to be. But here I'd quote a woman I respect, one of the former ministers from the Israeli Labour Party, Professor Yuli Tamir, who I think was a founding member of Peace Now. As I said, a woman of the left, and she wrote a piece when this government was formed. And she said, no one can blame Netanyahu for going into this government. I'm paraphrasing, yes? When we've decided we're boycotting him. In other words, normally after elections, people who fight and argue in Israel, proportional representation, multi-party system, every government is a coalition government. Normally after elections, you have people get together and they make deals. The fact that the parties of the center and the center left and the left said there's no way we're going to go with Netanyahu, he didn't have a choice. And that, not Mark Regev saying so, that Yuli Tamir said. And I think the Israeli center and Israeli center left have to think about their responsibility for the current Israeli government.
That's so the case, and many people have commented perhaps if he were to step aside, there might be a more middle ground that could be achieved. Anshel, what do you think?
Well, Mark chose to quote Yuli Tamir. I'll quote another Israeli politician who said back in 2008 that a prime minister facing criminal investigation and facing criminal charges cannot remain a prime minister, cannot serve and conduct him or herself as a prime minister in that situation. The Israeli center and center left had prime ministers who were in that situation. Ehud Olmert was one, Yitzhak Rabin was another. They both resigned the moment the prospect of criminal indictments loomed, and they were simply holding Netanyahu to that standard. And the man who said that back in 2008 is Benjamin Netanyahu. They were not boycotting. I dispute what Mark said. Netanyahu was not boycotted. Netanyahu was held to the very, very minimum basic standard that any public servant should be held. If you're being accused of serious corruption in office, you cannot remain until you've cleared your name. So there was no boycott. That is not an excuse in any way for Netanyahu of bringing into his government the most despicable, fascist, racist elements of Israel and of the Jewish people today. And if we have to compare, if we're talking about standards of previous prime ministers, Yitzhak Shamir, who was, if anything, much more to the right of Netanyahu, was a staunch right-winger, Likudnik, in many ways to the right of Netanyahu. Back in 1984, when Israel had a hung parliament, and they were constantly calculating, Mark spoke of proportional representation, then we had, thanks to the lower threshold, then one Knesset member from the same kind of party that is in Netanyahu's coalition today. That was Meir Kahane, the mentor and spiritual father of the Jewish Power Party in today's coalition. Shamir said, under no circumstances will they be part of our coalition, and I prefer not to be prime minister and for Likud to remain out of power rather than have Meir Kahane in my coalition. So there can be no excuse for what Netanyahu has legitimized Jewish fascism, Jewish supremacism, and the fact that the left and the center left, and not just them, parts of the right wing, Gideon Sa'ar is as right wing as Netanyahu, so is Naftali Bennett. The fact that some parties held Netanyahu to the most minimum of standards is not a boycott in any way.
So for you, the way forward is Netanyahu out.
Netanyahu cannot be the fact that we've somehow swallowed this total corruption of our political standards and allowed. This was totally inconceivable. Like I said, Netanyahu himself said so in 2008. The fact that a prime minister facing such serious charges can remain in power is inconceivable in any country with a minimum of any type of standard of public office. And the fact that Netanyahu added insult to injury by bringing in these elements. I mean, Jewish Power is a party which no sane and no one will sit with, no one will talk to them. That they are totally, they are boycotted around the world. Their ministers
I'll tell you what,
will not be met by with anyone. The fact that Netanyahu brought them in just shows how he is unworthy of the office of the Prime Minister of Israel. The fact that we're discussing it, we should be ashamed as Israelis and Jews that we're even discussing such an Israeli government.
Well, it's not so straightforward because there is a divide. There are people on both sides. So, for example, I know it's totally unscientific.
Yes, there's both sides of fascism. You're both sides.
The usual test on, well, at least my personal test, how I get my finger on the pulse as to reaction towards Prime Minister Netanyahu is when I'm in Israel, I love having chats with the taxi drivers or just any kind of local. And I was in Israel in July, and I actually found myself getting quite upset because it was around the time of the protests. I love Tel Aviv. I was looking to drive into Tel Aviv and we couldn't because of the roadblocks. And it was actually, I had a really interesting chat with someone, my taxi driver, who said to me, I've always loved Netanyahu because no matter what he does, he prioritizes the security of Israel and we can all get behind that. However, he, can't have a simple discussion with his grandchildren, with his children around the table anymore when it comes to Israel's judicial reform and the protests around that. And then there was, social media was covered with, police using water cannons against protesters and, pushing and violence. And I found myself thinking, these people might have served in a unit together. Can Israel really afford to be this divided? No matter what your standpoint is on this, why has Netanyahu's government not backed down when there are so many threats around it? And I just kind of thought, Mark, how do you feel watching, whatever your standpoint is on the judicial reform process, the protests have just divided Israel so much in a way I've never seen personally, at least. Or, how do you feel watching it on a human level, watching the division between Israelis, between families?
So it's clear that Israeli society is very polarized, and that one group of people, agree 100% with Anshel and think Netanyahu should have left office years ago and the government's terrible. And another group of people think the government speaks for them. And there are a lot of people who are Likud voters who don't like Ben Gvir, but they like Netanyahu. That's the reality. I would suggest, though, Sandy, a bit of historical perspective, because people say what Israel is going through now is unprecedented. I would at least ask people to think about that, because anyone who's studied Israeli political history knows that we've had polarizing moments in the past, very polarizing moments. Back in the early 50s, when Israel had the debate about accepting German reparations after the Holocaust. I mean, Menachem Begin led a violent demonstration outside the Knesset. There were actually rocks thrown at the Knesset and violence and tear gas. It was like a January 6th moment in Washington, yes? And Israel went through it in the early 50s. I've been writing a piece for the Jerusalem Post this weekend about the 50-year anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. So if people call today Netanyahu a dictator, people called Dayan a murderer. And Ben Gurion was called a dictator by his opponents.
But the name. Sorry, Mark.
I was going to say more recently, I remember I came to live in this country in 1982, and I remember the first Lebanon War, and then Sharon was a murderer, and huge demonstrations in the streets, and army office saying we're refusing to serve. So I think if one sees this as another moment of political crisis, and it is a crisis, yes, but the whole idea that everything's falling apart, I think with historic perspective, it can give you a little more, we've been there, done that.
It doesn't feel normal, even if it was, happened, what you're talking about in the 1950s. We're a long way forward. Israel's got a lot to do. Israel's got a lot of alliance, a lot to do. And can it afford to be this divided? What's your personal stance on the reforms? You don't have the political hat, as it were, on anymore.
Correct.
Have you protested yourself? What is your personal stance on the reforms?
So I'm probably where, according to polls, most Israelis are, that they support reform, and we do need reform, but with consensus. And the way that it's been done in this very polarizing way has been totally counterproductive. And I would say to people in the Likud, even if you're right, you have to choose your battles. On the other hand, when the Minister of Justice says, as he said on CBS on 60 Minutes, yes, he says you can't let the people spoke, there was an election, electoral reform was part of our agenda. Surely we have a right to move it forward. Elections have consequences. The other side says, of course, that you can't have elections and then change the rules, right? So it'd be best if President Herzog can succeed in finding consensus. I don't know what the probability is there, but that's where I am. I'd like to see reform with consensus.
And the name calling, I think it was this week, Netanyahu compared protesters joining forces with the PLO and Iran. I don't think it's the most constructive or the most diplomatic thing he could have said.
I agree. And I think he had to sort of clarify that afterwards because he knew he just played into the hands of his political opponents. But I mean, if you want to use harsh language, to be fair, harsh language is used by both sides. You get all these comments from the protesters that, that are also overbroken. It's part of our polarized political debate in Israel at the moment. And there's this dichotomy, there's this contradiction, because if you actually look at the issues, on substantive issues, Israelis aren't as divided at all this. As I said, on reform, most Israelis, like 66%, depending on the poll, support reform with consensus. On the Palestinian issue, it doesn't divide us like it used to in the past. There's more or less a consensus on that issue. The Israeli society is divided, but actually, I mean, on a superficial level, very divided, very polarized, but actually, when you get to the substance, much less so.
Anshel, how much of this is going to factor into your book? What part does Jewish fundamentalism play into this?
Well, my book isn't just about Israel. I mean, I'm not here to make a promo for my next book or for my previous book, which I can spot just over Mark's shoulder right now. I can see it there.
Sorry, this one.
Right, other way around.
That one.
Mark. There you go.
Yeah, sorry, it's because I'm in the reflection. That's Anshel's book.
What did you think of Anshel's book? Not that we're talking about your book too much.
The one I obviously haven't read the one that hasn't come out. I've only read the one about Netanyahu.
And
I thought of the English biographies of Netanyahu, the ones that are available, it was the best at the time.
And since?
Well, there's nothing. What has come out since in English?
Another book called Bibi, apparently.
No, that's an autobiography. It's not an autobiography. I've actually got them both next to each other. Sandy, if you can see, sorry, I've got it in my thing. There's the black Bibi book. Hang on, I'm very confused because I'm not used to doing this. There's the black Bibi book and there's the gray Bibi book. The gray one is an autobiography he wrote about himself, which, to be fair, he was actually nice to me in the book. And the other one is the black one is written by Anshel, which doesn't mention me at all. So I should be very offended. Yes, Anshel?
First of all, that's not true. It does mention you.
Oh, it does? I apologize.
It does mention you. And Bibi was not nice to me in his book. He said I was an unfriendly biographer. He didn't even mention me by name. But he did quote me because there was one bit that he liked about the book. But anyway, let's stop talking about my books.
Tell us about your stance on the protest.
So you asked a much more fundamental question. The reason that my next book is about Jewish fundamentalism is I do see what is happening to Judaism, and like I said, it's not just about Israel. It's something much wider happening in the Jewish world as one of the main, one of the main factors in what we're seeing today in Israel. And in that, I think I differ a bit with many of my colleagues on the left in Israel who see the entire reason for what's happening now in Israel, the occupation of the Palestinians and the ongoing conflict. And that is what has eroded democracy. And I agree with them to a degree, but I think that perhaps to a larger degree, our own Jewish identity, the way we relate to our Jewishness, the way our Jewishness dictates the way we live, the way and our relationship to the world, and how we balance our Jewish identity with other parts of our identities and other values that we may have, or what we even see as being Jewish values. I think this is a very large part of what's motivating this current coalition of destruction to basically try and fundamentally change Israel, to bulldoze through these changes. And Mark quite correctly said that Israel has faced similar crises before. You mentioned the 1950s reparations controversy, and then there were major controversies following Yom Kippur War and the 1982 war. And I'm not in any way belittling what happened then. The difference now isn't so much the crisis that is facing Israel; it's the state of Israeli society. And once again, even though I respect Mark hugely, and we've got a very long and friendly relationship, a professional relationship going back many years, I think that despite the way that many of the polls show that actually most Israelis don't differ on so many things, doesn't correctly capture the situation of Israeli society today. Israeli society today isn't divided over issues. It's divided over identity. It's divided mainly over its Jewish identity. The way that we see and the way that we put various values in balance is very much over the type of Jews we are. And if we see our Judaism as something which is evolving and which is part of a wider set of values and part of being a part of a regional and a global society, then then we have a certain political view. And those who at least think that their Judaism is never changing and it's been the same thing for the past 3,000 years, and anything which isn't under their very narrow definition of what Judaism means, that is all foreign and that all has to be kicked out. That has become very much the tone dominating this government, and it's become a fundamental rift within Israeli society to a degree that you're hearing from many supporters of the government that they don't even see people who think like me as being Jews. And now it used to be more that leftists are traitors. Now it's leftists aren't Jewish enough. And you see many of the mouthpieces of Netanyahu on places like Channel 14 who talk about people like me as not being sufficiently Jewish anymore. And Netanyahu basically gave the tone for that in his very first election in 1996, when the campaign worked on this sort of subtle, sometimes not so subtle messaging of the Jews against the Israelis, and the famous slogan, Netanyahu good for the Jews, and then Netanyahu saying to a rabbi, the left have forgotten what it is to be Jewish. This was originally an electoral ploy by Netanyahu to win elections by seeing which of the various electorates in Israel are more identify themselves more as Jews and which is more as Israelis. And this is metastatized over the last few decades. And we've reached the situation now in Israel where a political crisis, which, as Mark says quite correctly, is not the biggest political crisis ever facing Israel, is crashing onto Israeli society when Israeli society is much more vulnerable than it was in those previous crises, when Israeli society is much more divided, and the level of toxicity and pure hatred between parts of Israeli society has never been. And Mark once again said,
so Anshel,
on this, I don't think we are being alarmist when we're saying that the divides in Israeli society have never been as dangerous as they are right now.
So Anshel, tell me, looking forward and from the people you've spoken to, do you think, leveling that using the language that you've just talked about, that could actually alienate people from, or alienate Israelis from their Judaism if they have to pick a side?
But the problem is what is their Judaism, and I think this is one of the issues that Israelis are only now, especially secular and non-fundamentalist Israelis, are only now beginning to realize that they have to start defining their Judaism. I don't think when you say alienate from Judaism, I don't think that's a real thing. You're Jewish, that's it. Your Judaism is something that you have to that you have to define for yourself. And part of the problem of the, call it liberal Israel, is that they haven't realized that their Israeli identity is also a Jewish identity, and they've basically allowed this fundamentalist coalition, this sort of camps under the Netanyahu banner, to take monopoly over Judaism. And what we're seeing now in many different ways in this protest movement is Israelis reclaiming their Judaism. Actually, it's not alienating them, it's making them re-engage and say, actually, no, you Kahanists and you fundamentalists, you don't own Judaism. And we are now, me personally, I don't think I ever relinquished that. But many people in the liberal camp,
I tell you why. Because
are now re-engaging with it.
No, I hear you, because whenever religion is politicized, so for example, you had a lot of Israelis, especially young generation, especially Tel Avivians, refusing to get married in Israel. I remember speaking to one couple and asking them why they were going to Cyprus for the wedding, and they're like, "I don't want to get married by a wizard." I was like, "Sorry, wizard," and it needed to be clarified, and they explained to me that they actually meant rabbi. And then they went down that path into a whole discussion around who serves in the army, who doesn't serve in the army. And until that discussion, I never realized how connected Israeli politics and Judaism were. And on issues like this, it might come to fore as well. But if we were to look a bit more internationally, for example, you can't, especially under Netanyahu's tenure, bypass the importance of the Abraham Accords. Israel's now having open discussions, relations, ties to, whatever you want to call it, to Muslim majority countries. And it looks like, well, who knows, depends on the week, but it looks like there might be expansion. So if we were to talk about Saudi Arabia, this week, Crown Prince said there was more progression, there was going to be more normalized relations once the Israeli-Palestinian issue was resolved. Mark, you're our diplomat in chief this evening. How does that make you feel? How does that make you feel watching it from the outside? How involved are you on the inside, even if you're just having phone calls?
So, Sandy, with a second, I want to just deal with the philosophical Jewish side, and then I'll get to the diplomatic side, because Anshel deserves, I feel I have to say something. It's obviously very good to draw pictures, and it's a way to describe what's going on in Israel, and Anshel could be right in what he's saying. But I think the situation is more nuanced, and I'll give you just one picture. When the Knesset speaker was chosen, there was this vote. And 64 members of the coalition voted for a man who's openly gay. And some of them are homophobes. Some of them are very intolerant towards gay people. And yet they were forced, because of a coalition, to vote for the Likud candidate, who's very close to Netanyahu. That's why he got the job, probably. He's also a very effective politician. And so I think, the fact today that Israel has an opening gay, and our Speaker of our Parliament is number 2 in the hierarchy, in the formal hierarchy of protocol, yes, after the president, and he goes to all the national functions with his partner, Holocaust Day, Independence Day. And so to say that this government is only representing, I think the picture is, it's true, you have people who are very, very ultra-conservative. You could even use the word reactionary on these issues. But the government also contains other elements too, and I think we have to see the full picture. On your question, I'm actually, I don't want to say excited because I'm too old to get excited, but I'm actually quite upbeat about this Saudi Arabia business. I think it can happen. It can happen. We can have a breakthrough with Saudi Arabia, not because we're good people, or the Saudis are good people, or the Americans are good people. I believe in international relations. People pursue their own interests. Countries pursue their own interests. And what we're seeing now is a unique convergence of interests between Washington, Jerusalem, and Riyadh that makes a breakthrough deal possible. And the importance of Saudi Arabia can't be understated. Saudi Arabia has a special status not only in the Arab world, but in the Muslim world. There are 57 countries in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So 20 of them are Arab, but there's another 37 who are non-Arab countries. And some of them are Iran and Afghanistan. Obviously, there's not going to be any movement there, but you've got a host of Arab countries in Asia, of Muslim countries in Asia, and in Africa. And countries that have been sitting on the fence and not having diplomatic relations with Israel. You've got Arab countries in the Gulf that have been sitting on the fence. I think there's a chance that if we have this breakthrough with Saudi Arabia, it doesn't stop with Saudi Arabia. You will see others follow suit. You will see a fundamental change. And I use the term very knowingly. I say it's a game changer. Saudi Arabia, Anshel before spoke about Jewish tradition. So if Saudi Arabia makes peace with Israel, it's a kosher stamp. It's a kosher stamp for many people in the Arab world and in the Islamic world that Israel is kosher. And that's a major, major change. Now, why is it possible? And I'll say why. It's clear why the Americans want it. You have a president who his Republican opponents are portraying him as a dithering old man out of touch with reality, ineffectual, and so forth. Of course, American voters, like many voters, don't vote on foreign policy issues. But this is a way for the president to show vibrant leadership, to show that he's an international statesman, to show that he's doing the job, and from his point of view, especially with the polling so close, it could make the difference for him. I think also there's a long-term American policy goal here. First of all, of creating a more stable and secure Middle East, and also, the Saudi-American relationship has had a few bumps in the road over the last few months, going back to the last few years, I should say, going back to the Khashoggi business. And this is a chance to stabilize, reset, and even upgrade the US-Saudi relationship. From Riyadh's perspective, they have, for years, maybe longer, for decades, they've wanted a NATO-type official commitment of the US to the security of their kingdom. And they feel now there's a window of opportunity. And if they don't take the window of opportunity, who knows what happens if Biden is reelected? Who knows what happens if Biden is not reelected? Do they want to take the risk? And the idea of upgrading the nature of the American commitment to their security, and at the same time upgrading their military, and to be frank, it's a problem for Israel, their nuclear power program. For them, if they think this is a window and the door can close, they're going to jump at the opportunity. Once again, these have been long-term Saudi goals that they've wanted for a long time. And from the way the Crown Prince spoke yesterday on television in America, he was quite upbeat about the possibility of a breakthrough. From Netanyahu's point of view, I mean, since coming back and fighting his way to the top, he was once a superstar statesman, and now he's the brunt of protesters and sitting in a coalition with some people that he probably doesn't particularly like. This is a chance to reinvent himself as the statesman, to do a bargain, to make a deal. He can do it, I believe. I'm not sure all his coalition partners can. It might force a change in the Israeli government, or it could force new elections. There'll be a majority in the Knesset in favor of the agreement. I think that's a given. But from Netanyahu's perspective, it works well. And I said at the beginning why it's good for Israel. It's a breakthrough relationship with the Arab and the Muslim world. So when it's in Israel's interests, when it's in Saudi Arabia's interests, and when it's in America's interests, and it's all happening at the same time, this can work.
How naive am I being, just kind of looking at this and saying, why are we getting so excited about building relations with a country that has such different values to Israel's democratic values? You talked about Khashoggi, we talked about, there are many things we could talk about. How imperative is it, and how that Israel builds relations with, with a country like Saudi Arabia? Why are we so excited?
Sandy, to be fair,
yeah,
if we wait for the Arabs to become democracies before we talk to them, we're not going to talk to anyone. And I would say to you as a British citizen, if the British can have a UK embassy in Saudi Arabia, why can't Israel? If the Americans can have an American embassy in Saudi Arabia, what do you expect from Israel that you don't expect from yourself? Arab-Israeli peace is more important than a lot of other issues. And I wouldn't hold Israel to a standard that you don't hold anyone else to.
What do you think, Anshel?
Well, I think that it obviously be a much better situation than the one today if Israel has diplomatic relations and there's a freedom to travel and to do business openly with as many of our neighbors in the region. I just, let's also call this what it is. It's not a peace. Israel's never been at war with the Saudis, and therefore it's not a peace deal. This is formalizing a situation in which Israel has already had a quiet alliance with the Saudis for years. It's good to bring this out in the open. Things should be out in the open. And Mark is 100% correct. If Israel only had ties with democracies, Israel wouldn't have a tie with itself, because it's not a very good democracy as it's in itself. It's a democracy only as far as the green line, and then it becomes a military dictatorship. So we're very much a very limited edition of a democracy as well. So I was kind of flabbergasted by the antics of Israel's current ambassador to the UN, putting up a picture of that slain woman in Iran. He's not the person to be making that kind of gestures. The Iranians are much worse than Israel. There should be no question about it. But Israel's got a lot to fix on its own human rights record. But back to the Saudis, who are also much worse.
Well, I actually quite liked your segue into Iran.
But I wanted to say something about the Saudis. I think this is a process that's been happening in the region for decades now. It's been happening because slowly but surely the focus of many parts of the Arab world has moved to the kind of deals that they can do with Israel on economy and security and so on. That there is a joint enemy in Iran, and the kind of fervor and passion that many, certainly in the ruling classes, perhaps not more the grassroots, had for the Palestinian issue has certainly gone down. So what we're seeing here is something which is going to happen. There is going to be at some point a more formal and open relationship between Israel and the Saudis, as there has become now with the Emiratis. But I don't think it's going to be as pivotal or as exciting or as special as some people make it out to be. It's just going to be a confirmation of the process in which it's an important step, but it's a step that we're on the way to. And sadly, it won't solve any of the core problems. Israel, Yom Kippur next week, Israel will be marking the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War was the last real war between Israel and an Arab country. All the wars Israel's had since have been with non-state actors or proxies. So in a sense, Israel for the last 50 years has been moving away from a state of war with the Arab countries. And that's this issue with the Saudis is just another stage in that. It's important, but let's not blow it out of proportion. We'll still have very much the same problems we have here in Israel and with our immediate neighbors, the Palestinians and the Syrians and Hezbollah, Lebanon as well. We're not making peace with them.
If you do look at obstacles, and I don't know how big an obstacle it would be, in reaction to the Crown Prince's comments, the Iranian president was not very happy. He almost implied, I think he actually specifically said it would be a stab in the back for the Palestinian people. It could harm the détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Mark, what's the way forward when it comes to Iran? Is there an answer?
So I want to give a small factual correction, especially if Anshel's going to write a book about this. If I'm not mistaken, the Saudis did send, maybe just token, but they did send forces to fight us in 48. But check that out, because it's not the same as as the UAE and Bahrain. But you will check me out. You can look at Google now and tell me if I'm misinforming the Anglo-Israel Association audience. I think it really is a big deal. It's true that we've had this under-the-table relationship with Saudi Arabia for quite some time. And now when Israelis get on El Al airplanes and fly to Thailand or to Hong Kong, they fly over Saudi airspace, yes? So it's clear that the situation today in Saudi Arabia is probably better than it's ever been. But I do think there's still a huge difference between a sort of a tacit understandings and between a formal relationship. And don't forget, what has Zionism been all about? It's about returning the Jewish people to their homeland and to be accepted as part of the neighborhood, right? Not to be seen as a foreign colonial implant as some people like in Syria and Lebanon and some of the Palestinians say. So the idea that someone like Saudi Arabia would recognize Israel's legitimacy, I don't think that can be understated. As I said before, I think it'll have a rollover effect with others, and it's a game changer. Saudi Arabia has a special status in the Arab and the Muslim world, and the importance of Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel formally, I think, is important. On Iran, I think the fact that the Iranians are worried about it, and the statements that you said by the Iranian president, the fact that he said that, it shows that this is a serious thing, that this is for them a problem, because of course they don't like it. And if he says that's the end of the Saudi-Iran detente, that's also very interesting. What is more interesting, Sandy, is the Palestinians, who, you'll recall when we had the Abraham Accords, they went bananas. Yes, they said all these outrageous things about the UAE and Bahrain, and at the end they had to take it back. With the Saudis are being very clever, they've had a delegation in the West Bank, and there's been delegations of Palestinians going to try to make it so they're working together on this. Like, the Palestinians have decided there's no point fighting Saudi Arabia. They're too powerful, they're too rich, and they're trying to see how can they won't come out and support the deal, but they won't necessarily oppose it either, in the same way that they opposed the Abraham Accords, because once again, it's been done already. The Saudis are taking it to a new level. And I think ultimately, if I can be philosophical for a moment, before Anshel was philosophical, so I can be philosophical myself, though it's more difficult for a diplomat to be philosophical. But I would say the following. Look, the Palestinians are part of the Arab world. That's their family. That's their focus group. And as more and more Arab countries recognize Israel, see Israel as a legitimate part of the region, make peace with Israel, cooperate with Israel, work with Israel, in the medium and long term, that has to affect Palestinian opinion too. And just as rejectionism, we hope, is a dying force in the Arab world, it's still there. I mean, Anshel just talked about Syria and Hezbollah and Hamas and others, yes. But if rejectionism is becoming a dying force in the Arab world, hopefully it'll become a dying force on the Palestinian side too. And
Iran, is there a way forward there?
I'd like to be optimistic on Iran, but it's very difficult to be optimistic on Iran. I found an old passport at home. I visited Iran as a young man when the Shah was still in power. I grew up in Australia, as you know, and the way you used to fly to Israel is you stopped off at Tehran to change planes to fly to Tel Aviv. And I've got this great Iranian visa in my passport, which I should keep, yes. How many Israeli officials have been to Iran if they didn't work for the Mossad? And I never did, as far as I know. The point being is this, that there's really no reason for a conflict between Israel and Iran. There's no territorial dispute, there's no political dispute. In the past, we were friends of the Iranians. It's all about the regime. Or, as to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it's the regime stupid. When you have a regime that is committed to this sort of very radical interpretation of the Islamic Revolution, yes, and that Israel is fundamentally illegitimate, there's a problem. And what do you do with that sort of situation?
Do you agree, Anshel?
I think that Iran and Israel will one day be allies again, and hopefully it's in Mark's lifetime and in my lifetime. I mean, Sandy, you're much younger than us, so you've got a better chance. But I really hope, and I don't see any reason for that not being. And I agree, religion is an issue, and the same way that Jewish fundamentalism is currently ruining Israel, Islamic fundamentalism is the main reason that we don't have a relationship with the Iranians right now. And I think hopefully that will change. But this is something that the Iranians will change. I don't think that we in the West or in any other country besides Iran really have much of a way of changing them. This is something that, and we're seeing it. We're seeing now in Israel, brave women going out on the streets and fighting against a government and against the clerics. Like I said, Israel and Iran are not so different from each other, and I hope that we'll be back.
Please, Anshel, take that back.
Israel and Iran are not so different.
I mean, with all our faults this government has, we still have democratic elections.
We've got a free press. Our nations were allies. Our nations were allies, and I hope we'll be allies again. And everywhere in the world, we're seeing these different kind of clashes, and human beings rise up against these kind of things. The Iranians are doing it, Israelis are doing it, and I don't say it's the same situation, but there's very often a similar kind of passion. And thankfully, brave young women are in both countries leading the fight.
It's a very civil spat. So just before, I would really like everyone watching who stayed with us so far, please do submit questions in the comment section, and we will get to them shortly. Just before we do go to them, I really, Anshel, you report and represent or cover Israel internationally through the media. Mark, you've done so diplomatically. Does the world see the best of Israel? Does it see its politics? What, and if not, what needs to be done? If Mark, I could come to you first.
So maybe I'm just an eternal optimist, but I actually see an advantage in the current polarization in Israel. Because back in the, when I was ambassador in London all those years ago, Israel's enemies portrayed us as a racist, apartheid, authoritarian state occupiers, yes? And now the pictures coming out of Tel Aviv, I'm not sure they're intended that way, but you've got all these Israelis yelling democracy and waving Israeli flags. And the narrative is now Israeli democracy is under threat. An apartheid state is not under threat. A racist colonialist implant isn't under threat. Israeli democracy is under threat. So whether that's true or not, whether there is a real threat to Israeli democracy or not, we can discuss, yes? But the fact that people are saying Israeli democracy, and the fact I think is a recognition in large parts of civil society across the West, which, in the past we're all too ready to dismiss Israel as something else. I think there is an appreciation. It maybe inadvertently, these protests have helped Israel's status in the world.
I totally agree. The world is now seeing the best of Israel in the protests. There's no question about that. And I also agree with something else that Mark said. The world is, and the media is not as hostile as some of us feel, because everybody here on this panel, and I'm sure everyone watching, feels very passionately about Israel, and therefore, whenever there is something critical, we feel it much more intensely. But at the same time, the world is not that. We think everyone's focused about us. We're not that. We're not the biggest focus of the world, as some people tend to think. And even Mark told me that when he was ambassador and he would go and he would slip out to go and watch a film in London, he was surprised that nobody recognized him in the cinema. And this is Mark Regev, the face of Israel on CNN and BBC for so many years. The truth is that there is a lot of passion, a lot of interest in Israel, but it's not as wide and as big as we think. We're not as, we should also kind of keep this perspective and proportion. We're a small country. We do kick up, we do punch above our weight, and there is more interest in Israel than there is in other similar sized countries. But at the end of the day, the world is not constantly on our case as we tend to feel. It's 3 or 4 news organizations. That's it, more or less.
Can I add something, please, Sandy? Just I have to. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, he will correct me. Wrote a piece. I think it was in 2017, maybe 18. Once again, he will correct me. And about in the New Statesman, where he talked about the Tibetan issue, and he said there was a time that all the progressives and people who were part of the literati were Tibet, 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 and the issue died. And no one today, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but really Tibet is not an issue that galvanizes demonstrations in the West or so forth. Is it still perceived by some as occupied by China and so forth? Of course, but it's just not an issue. It's not, other things are more important. And you wrote in that piece that the Palestinians have a danger that they will become Tibet, that if they continue the way they are, they're yesterday's news. And the fact that the Arab world is, I don't want to say leaving the Palestinians, but has moved on and is now no longer allowing the Palestinian issue to dominate the way that they look at the world and the relationships that they have. They're not accepting, to quote Netanyahu, I shouldn't do it, but they're not accepting a Palestinian veto anymore over their foreign policies. Maybe that sort of reality check can be something that's actually good for peace, that they will understand that they're not the center of the world. Anshel said quite correctly, Israel isn't the center of the world. Well, if we're not the center of the world, the Palestinians aren't either. And maybe they can...
I hear you both, and I must say I've just had to have a Google to see if I've gone mad, because I personally do feel like there's a disproportionate focus on Israel, especially when it comes to Middle Eastern politics. So I've just clicked on one news website, and the first story is Saudi-Israeli deal getting closer. The second story is 6 Palestinians killed in the West Bank and Gaza. Is it because we provide a disproportionate form of access? Is it because we're a democracy? Because Israel is a democracy? You know, are we all really just a bit mad and thinking there's too much focus on Israel?
I think it is. I think it is disproportionate. I'm not disagreeing with that. I don't think it's as disproportionate or that many people are focused on Israel as we think and feel. Like I said, it's mainly 3 or 4 news organizations. I can tell you from within those news organizations that often they know that these are not the most popular stories. And nowadays we can measure, because now everything is online, we can measure how many clicks we get. So. Yeah. These stories, and there was a reason I used the Tibet analogy, because it's something, and Mark quite correctly brought it up. I wrote it in the New Statesman and in other places as well, that the Palestinians are becoming Tibet. But this is also my argument, not just with people who are so passionate about defending any kind of criticism of Israel, also within my own, within my own political camp, you could say, the center left. The people have been saying for so many years within the left, Israel needs to end the occupation and end the conflict with the Palestinians, because if not, the world will force us to do so through boycotts and terrible things will happen to us. No, that's not going to happen. I've been saying to my friends on the left for so many years, don't wait around for the world to pressure Israel to end the occupation. We need to end the occupation because the occupation is bad. It corrupts us. It brutalizes us. We should not be occupying another nation. The world is not going to force Israel. And as we're talking now, the Saudis are about to become the 6th or the 7th. I've lost count already. I'm not sure if Mark could give us the number of Arab nations now formally, and I think most of the Arab nations informally accept Israel now.
So what I'm going to do now, thank you guys both for that. I'm going to go to some of the questions, and if we could get through as many as possible, I'm going to read out, and if you've got an answer, go for it. So perhaps for Mark, is India becoming a worldwide force beneficial for Israel?
Yes.
Okay. Next one. With the high-tech sector 50% of Israel's exports and employing 500,000 people, what can the government do to encourage this sector to continue to invest in Israel? What more can we do to boost business ties?
Netanyahu can resign, and we can have a government which will actually be open to engaging with the tech sector and will invest in the workforce that Israel really needs, rather than pouring billions into education which has no mathematics, no English, no science in it. That's what the government can do.
I suppose this is one for both of you. Why should opposition parties trust Netanyahu when he broke his agreement with Gantz only a few years ago? And I believe with other people as well.
So first of all, I was a bit flippant on India. India is a very important partner to Israel, yes? Mm-hmm. And I shouldn't understate it. It's a very important relationship for us, a very close relationship. I was flying through Asia, and I stopped once at my friend, the Israeli ambassador in Delhi, and it's a very, very strong relationship. And the change of India's attitude to Israel, which is much more strong today. In the past, India there was the non-aligned movement, and there was Nehru, and there was Nasser, and there was Tito, right? And they were all very anti-Israel. And the fact that one of the leaders, a country that was a pivot in the non-aligned movement, is now Israel's best friend, I think that also shows of Israel's changing status in the movement. About the second question, if Netanyahu
the trustworthiness.
Yeah. I think all of politics is, what's the word? I think Ronald Reagan said, trust and verify. I think in all politics is a very interesting business. You don't have to read Machiavelli to know that it has its own rules and its own logic. If Benny Gantz goes back into a coalition government with Netanyahu, it's not impossible. It could happen under certain circumstances. We know what happened in the past. Benny Gantz knows what happened in the past, but politics is politics. You always see, the best example is in America, where you have these primary candidates who, of the same party, who tear each other apart, and then they all unite in November to win the election, yes? Politics is politics.
Anshel?
Well, the question was, why should Gantz trust Netanyahu? The answer is he shouldn't. He absolutely should not trust Netanyahu. Is that a reason not to have another agreement, not to have another coalition with him? I'd say it's a very strong reason against. There are other reasons why Gantz at some point should probably consider, and those reasons have to be a total end of all the judicial overhaul that's being happened now, a total banishment from the coalition of the racist elements, and probably only a limited time in which he'll support this Netanyahu until the agreement with the Saudis has been finalized, and then Israel should go back to another election.
So I'm going to read another question out. The crisis has highlighted the schism in Israeli society, religious versus secular, serving in the army against those who don't serve, working to earn a living, paying tax versus beneficiaries. Who is capable of uniting these camps?
Mashiach.
I'm a bit more optimistic. I don't think we have to wait for the Messiah. Let's say if we look at the religious divide, and it's a very controversial issue, as you know, Sandy, about the ultra-Orthodox who are excused from military service. But in many ways, it's like secular Israelis don't like it, but they've learned to live with it. And I think for many secular Israelis, it's more important we see there's ultra-Orthodox in the workforce and paying taxes than going to the army. Not that we'll say it publicly, yes, but you have to, as I said before in another issue, you pick your fights, you pick your battles. And seeing the ultra-Orthodox more involved in the Israeli economy is probably more important at this stage, I believe.
If we move on to another question, so we say from Northern Ireland Friends of Israel, is the Iranian threat imminent and existential? If so, how dangerous is the current political and social division to Israel's safety?
I think that if the current leader of Iran, Khamenei, and his predecessor Khomeini, I mean, the leaders of Iran since the revolution, if they had the capabilities to destroy Israel, I think they would. They don't, and therefore it's not imminent and not existential. Israel is a strong country, thanks to those who do serve in its security forces, thanks to those who do develop its technological edge. I don't see that in danger. I'm not saying for any moment we should underrate Iran as a threat to Israel, but it's not imminent and existential. And yes, Israel's edge against the Iranians is now being jeopardized by the way that the current Netanyahu government is treating those parts of Israeli society which have kept it safe from Iran for so many years.
There's a question that's come up a couple of times. There is talk of concessions to Palestinians in return for a deal with the Saudis. What concessions is Bibi in a position to make? Mark?
So, I would, first of all, on the Iranian issue, I agree with what Anshel has said. We're strong, but I don't think Israel can allow the Iranians to get a nuclear weapon. And I think Israel has to be prepared to have a military option. And I think we have to be willing to use the military option if we need to. And I know a lot of effort has been put into that in the last couple of years. And people say correctly, you say, well, a military option doesn't solve the problem. That's correct. It doesn't solve the problem, but it does delay. And if you delay the process, you buy time. When Begin destroyed the Ost-Iraq reactor in 1981, the Iraqi nuclear program, military intelligence and the Mossad, other people were against the attack. They said, the best thing you do is you buy a couple of years. But you buy a couple of years and then something else can happen, as happened in Iraq. They never did reestablish their nuclear program. So I think Iran with a nuclear weapon, Israel can't live with. And if they get close to it, the situation becomes very dangerous and you force Israel's hand. On the issue, I'll be brief because I've spent too much time talking about that. But on the issue of the Palestinian track, look, there's been a huge change in the Saudi position. In the past, the Saudis' official position was we'll only normalize relations with Israel when there's a Palestinian state on the 67 borders, East Jerusalem is its capital, and then there's peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and we can make a deal with Israel. And that's not the Saudi position today. If you listen very carefully yesterday to the interview given by Mohammed bin Salman, he said, we want better life for the Palestinians. So in the framework of better life, I think Netanyahu can do many things. And the minute the Saudis are lowering the bar and talking about practical things, Netanyahu can do it. Once again, I'm not sure all his coalition partners will agree, but I believe Netanyahu can do it and will want to do it.
And just finally, we've got time for one more question. A question to you both, actually. How worried are the speakers about the damage to Israel's social fabric? that is so apparent from the current political state of affairs? Mark, do you want to go first?
I can go for. I didn't want to push in front of Anshel.
Anshel, do you want to go? Whoever. Who's more worried?
All right.
Who's more worried?
There are some things that worry me.
I'll end with the alarm.
All right. I think there's a growing intolerance in Israeli society on both sides. I think there's messianism on the religious right, but there's also there's a messianism on the left as well. And I'll give you an example. There's a man who I've read his books. I think he's written more books than Anshel even. He's called Michael Bar Zohar, and he was the first serious biographer of Ben Gurion. There are now better biographies, but he wrote this three-volume biography of Ben Gurion. He wrote a good biography of Shimon Peres. He's a very serious man. He was a Labour member of Knesset for many years, and he was on the radio the other day, and he said he's totally opposed to the government's judicial reforms, totally opposed. And then he said, but all the IDF reservists who are saying they're not going to serve, they're throwing out, my words, not his, I'm giving a metaphor, yes, they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. This is very, very dangerous. And there's one thing to demonstrate and to make your position known and make noise, but there are some things that are very, very dangerous to tamper with. And I think many people who are sympathetic to the protest movement, they also draw a line on this, and the polling shows that this is antagonizing a lot of middle-of-the-road Israelis. This is dangerous. This shouldn't be done, and it opens the door for people on the right to say, well, like when Sharon moved out of Gaza, yes, we can have a whole army unit saying we're refusing to follow orders. This is very dangerous, and I would urge people on both sides of the spectrum, right? This sort of thing has to be seen as totally unacceptable.
Just really very quickly, this is not people refusing to obey orders. This is volunteers who cannot be required to continue volunteering for a country.
I didn't say they could be required. I'm saying they're doing the wrong thing.
But they're not doing anything. They're saying we will not serve a dictatorship.
So they're letting the country down. They're letting the country down.
No, they are fighting for their country, which will not be their country if it becomes a religious dictatorship. And that is something which I think is a reason why I'm less worried now, because people are prepared to call it what it is, and people are prepared to stand up. And I think what we've seen in the last few months has made me less worried than I was on the night after the elections. Is that and the polls are showing that there is a clear majority against this awful government. So I was very worried for the social fabric of Israel 8.5 or 9.5 months ago, and I think now we are seeing Israel beginning to return, certainly from the polls, we're seeing Israel beginning to return to its senses. We're seeing the mainstream of Israeli society remembering what the core ideals of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state are. And I'm still worried, but I'm much less worried than I was 8 or 9 months ago, because the people that Mark is now maligning, sadly, because I don't think he should be saying that, but he is. The people who are prepared, and instead of criticizing them, I haven't heard a word of criticism from Mark for the fascists now in government. So it's, if Ben Gvir doesn't deserve even one word of criticism from you, Mark, then, and you've kept your criticism for people who are standing up for Israeli democracy, that does kind of worry me about Mark Regev.
I didn't criticize the people standing up for Israeli democracy. I criticized those who are politicizing service in the IDF. I think that's very, very dangerous. Bar Zohar supports the protest.
Any service you do for your country is also a political act. Deciding to
make
obey
it. I'll tell you what. Well, perhaps the AIA will let us.
I'm much more optimistic on this eve of this Yom Kippur, at the beginning of this new Jewish year, than I was earlier in the last Jewish year, because I think that Israeli society is beginning to stand up and come to its senses.
Perhaps the AIA will let us make it a two-parter. So it's for the new year. Thank you, everyone. I think that's all we've got time for. I thank you all for taking part, especially our panelists, Mark, Anshel. Super interesting, a lot to think about. And thank you for being here with us this evening.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Okay.